Oh, good morning, everybody. How are you? Good to see you guys today. Who said good morning real loud? That was nice. I don't know who said that, but that was good. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. You guys are like, Brad, it's afternoon. Like, what are you No, it's not. It's getting close, though. Just wait till I'm done preaching. Then no, I'm kidding. We won't go that long either. I had a long day yesterday. Started out like early morning at the soccer fields. Anyone else, soccer parents, doing the thing like I was doing yesterday? All right, yeah. It's nice when you're waking your kids up like an hour before they normally go to school to go to soccer. You're like, what is wrong with this picture, you know? Parents all huddled down. Like there was a spot where we were all sitting because there was sunshine and there was shade and all the parents were huddled together, just like, just dying together. So did the soccer thing yesterday and then dove into one of those long sunny Saturdays where you try to get more done than is humanly possible. Anyone do that yesterday? Yeah, exactly, yeah. Wash the cars. Anyone wash the cars yesterday? Yeah, all right, awesome, good. Yeah, did 2 yesterday, thought I'll try to get all this different stuff done. So yesterday was one of those days I'm just packing it all in, and we had dinner plans last night. And so I'm going through the whole day, and I'm not really thinking about the dinner plans, not really thinking about it to the point that we were a little late to the dinner plans. But it's one of those times when I was just so focused on getting things done that dinner really wasn't top priority in my thinking. And then we were driving over, and Sherry and I are in a conversation. We come around the corner, we pull up to the house, and as we pull up to the house, my friend is out in front. He's got his barbecue grill in the driveway, and he's grilling in the front of the house. There are 2 reasons that a man grills in the front of his house, all right? Reason number 1 is his backyard is completely unfinished, torn up, under construction, and it makes it virtually impossible to be out there. My friend, point number 1, qualification. That's one of the reasons he was out front. The other reason that a man barbecues out front is that he is so good, so proficient, so amazing that the wonders that he works with this thing should be on display for the entire world to see. My friend qualifies for that as well. Like he's definitely like the guy is a master with the grill. And so I'm really glad. Like I pull up and I see that dinner is going to be the barbecue grill, whatever it involves. Like, yeah, I'm looking at the neighbors like, that's right. I'm eating here tonight. Like I'm proud of this moment. And so I get out of the car, I walk up the driveway, and he looks at me and he kind of smiles a little bit and kind of gives the eyebrows like, you ready for this? And then he rolls the top back. And there inside are 2 amazing racks of baby back ribs, like pork ribs, perfectly braised, the smells rising. I mean, like there's this moment, and I suddenly I got so excited. Like I just got excited like a kid on Christmas, like ribs, because my friend makes some of the best ribs on the planet. Like he makes really, really good ribs. His ribs are so good that when we showed up, he goes, "Where are the kids?" And I go, "Well, they had stuff to do." And he's like, "You mean you guys came over here, like you could have had like a date night and you came over here to hang out with us and our 2-year-old? Like, are you kidding me?" And what he didn't know was that I was strategic, because I figured if I don't tell him my kids aren't coming, he'll make ribs for my kids, right? And then I can eat all the ribs I want. So like immediately I'm like, man, it's good to be me. I'm going to eat lots of ribs. He's so good. Seriously, his ribs are this good. He's got a friend that lives down the street, mutual friend of ours. He's texting him. The guy is so sick he can't leave his house. He's texting him and he says, "Man, do you think there's any way you could get a couple ribs down to me? I think I might be able to eat some. I might be able to force some down." Like so sick, and yet he still wants his ribs. They're that good. And so we go inside, and we're sitting at the table, and this is not an exaggeration. At one point, I realized, like, I blacked out. I'm eating the ribs, and there's conversation going on, and I'm just so focused. And all of a sudden, I realized I have no idea what anybody's talking about. And so I looked up, and they were all looking at me, and I said, "Guys, I'm so sorry." I said, "Honestly, these ribs are so good. I forgot where I was." Like, it just, like, these ribs are amazing. Like, they're that good. And so, like, every time he makes them, he's been making them for me for a couple of years. Every time he makes them, I'm just like, man, I love his ribs, right? Now, this is what inevitably happens. I tell people, I go, "Hey, like, his ribs are amazing, whatever." And what do people do? Anybody thinking this? Somebody says, "I'll bet you I can make them better," right? I can make them better. This happens all the time. Like, I'll bet you, Nick's always like, "I can make better ribs than Iran." And we're yet to prove this yet. I still am waiting for the challenge. After the last service, Mike Johnson said to me, he goes, "Man, that's a really cheesy way to get people to invite you over for ribs." But this happens all the time. People go, man, and then what they do, they go, what's his process? And I'm not telling you his process, okay? I'm not telling you what he does, how he makes his ribs. He's told me, and I can reproduce it, but I'm not telling you. These are like state secrets as far as I'm concerned. This is important information. But inevitably, people will look at me and they'll go, well, here's what I do. And they start talking about the sauce. They talk about the meat. They talk about the spices. They talk about what they do, like all these different things. They tell me all these different things. And it's like, you know what? And I had to apologize to my mom in the first service. So I was like, it doesn't matter how good they think they can make them. They just don't measure up to Aaron's ribs. Like he makes amazing ribs. They're really that good. And one of the reasons they're so good is it's not about the ingredients. Like, you can talk about ingredients all day long. You can talk about the sauce and you can talk about the meat. You can do all those things. But the reality is his ribs are so good because of the process. Like, there's something about the process that matters. You can have all the stuff, all the ingredients, but if you don't do the process right, then you don't get greatness in the form of a rib in your hand. That's just the way it is. And this is what's fascinating. For most of us, we like the product. A lot of us like the product. Like, generally speaking, we like to get down to the very end and we like to look and say, this is like whatever we're left with, that's really good. We like the product of the whole thing. But generally speaking, we don't really like the process that much. Like most of us. I mean, otherwise we would all be cooking great ribs, right? We like the product, but we don't necessarily appreciate the process that's involved. And that's not just with ribs, that's in life in general. For most of us, we like the product, but we don't like the process. If we're given the choice, if you think about this, if we're given the choice between greatness or fast mediocrity, what do we choose? We choose fast mediocrity, right? Like, if we have the choice between fast or great, we choose fast. If we have a choice between now or best, we choose now. Like, we do this all the time with things. How do I know this? Because there's a sandwich that exists that's called the McRib. Right? Like, case in point, the McRib sandwich. Like the McRib. I talked about the McRib before the 9 o'clock service, and Brad, who's playing bass this morning, he's like, McRib, is it back? I'm like, no, it's not back. Hopefully it never comes back. And then they're like, oh, I think it's only a winter thing. What are you talking about? Like, it's a McRib. There's not even ribs in there. There's no, what? Do you ever wonder to yourself, how does somebody make ribs and there's no bone in it? Like, the Clue phone should be ringing, right? Like somebody pick it up. There's something wrong with this. Sometimes I wonder about my own life, and I just evaluate, and I think about my frustration in life, like the things I get frustrated about. Or I think about my anxiety. Or I think about my unhappiness. I think about my discontentedness. I think about moments when I'm just not settled in my heart. I think about moments when I'm frustrated. I think about things that I get angry about, things that I'm disappointed with in my life. When I think about those things, and this is what I wonder if the reason I feel those things is because I want greatness, but I settle for fastness all the time. I kind of wonder if I'm so desiring something. I mean, I think it's in my heart. I mean, I want great. I mean, deep in my soul, I want great. I want excellent. I want the best possible. But I also like fast, and I think I like fast so much that I just settle, and I settle for things that aren't great. And in the process, I find myself discontent or depressed or angry or unhappy or just anxious or whatever, like the list of emotions. I wonder about this. Because I can be so focused on the product, so focused on getting whatever it is that I want, that I forget about the process. Even at times, forgetting about the process or even resenting the process of what it takes to get greatness. And I think this is true for most of us. I think for most of us, we take shortcuts. We take shortcuts because we want the product, but we don't want the process. I mean, you think about all the corners that we cut and the places that we avoid and the things that we do. You think about it with education. Education's a place where people cut corners, and later on they regret the corners that they cut with those things, right? We cut corners in food preparation, and we go, oh yeah, that was mediocre. It wasn't what we thought it was going to be. We cut corners in our pursuit of joy or happiness. We cut corners relationally, and there's damage. We cut corners in sexuality. We pursue sexuality and try to gratify ourselves in ways that just leave us short, and it's never as great as we thought. And I mean, you just like look down the list, like you just look at life, like whatever, like we spend money that we don't have to get what we want now, and then it just never seems to, like you just look at the list of things that we do, we're always cutting corners, we're always taking shortcuts because we don't like the process, we want the product. Unfortunately, when we skip the process, we never experience greatness. Because greatness is something that comes as a result of the process. Process is what produces greatness, not fastness. Today we're looking at a real pivotal moment in the life of David where everything's really going to shift and change in a pretty remarkable way. And I know I've said this before as we've moved through this series, but David, he responds to some very specific circumstances in a way that is so counterintuitive to how we respond to similar circumstances in our life that it requires that we stop and look at them a little closer. And it's not one of those things where you go, man, I'm never going to be like David. I'm never going to be able to live that. No, it's one of those things where what he does and how he responds to his circumstances is so unique that if we stop and we pause and we look into those circumstances, we actually have the opportunity to see some things that lead to our understanding of why David was as great as he was. David's greatness is something we're still talking about. Somehow, his responses, what was going on inside of him, resulted in us in 2014 still talking about his life. And so I think it's valuable for us to pause and look and say, man, maybe there's a new way of understanding experiencing greatness. Maybe there's a new way of becoming great. Maybe there's a new way of understanding what life is all about. So we're going to start in 1 Samuel chapter 31 this morning, and we're going to be moving into 2 Samuel. And so if you have your Bible, you can take that out. If you don't, all the words will be on the screen, so you can follow along there. But as you're opening up to 1 Samuel 31, I just want to recap a little bit, because in this series, we've covered a lot of ground in David's life, but I think when you come to this moment, it's really important that we kind of get ourselves up on top of a hillside and look out at the landscape and see the larger picture of what's gone on in David's life and what happens in this moment in light of it. David, as a young boy, is identified as the future king of Israel. A guy named Samuel, who's a prophet, shows up at his dad's house. Line up all the brothers. David's the least likely of all of his brothers to be chosen. Nobody thought that he would be, and yet he was chosen to be king. And then the first few weeks of this series, we looked at the early years of David's life where he exhibited incredible faithfulness, accomplishes some amazing things. He slays the giant Goliath. He becomes a national hero. He leads the military of Israel into battle, gains more and more authority. He actually gains the favor of Saul for a very short time. Saul is the king of Israel who gives him one of his daughters. He becomes his father-in-law. And then after becoming his father-in-law and seeing David's notoriety, Saul grows incredibly bitter and jealous towards David. So jealous that what we've basically covered from that point to this point has been years of David literally living on the run. He's living for Israel. He's fighting their battles. He's defending the people. But in this whole process, David is running from his murderous, jealous, angry father-in-law who just wants to kill him. That's what David's spending his life doing. He's just on the run. And so that's what David's experiencing, to the point that he's even had to run to the Philistines. He's made mistakes. He's done all kinds of things, but all of it with this tension of there's a promise that was given to me when I was young, and now I'm not experiencing that promise. Instead, I'm experiencing this life of ups and downs and always fearing for my life from this crazy father-in-law of mine. So he's got this thing in his heart, though, that's always there. Someday, I'm going to be king. This promise of someday, I'm going to get there. Someday, this thing is embedded inside of him. And so no matter where he's going or what he's doing, he's always carrying this thing with him of someday, this is going to happen. Like the dream will be realized. That's the context for where this story picks up in 1 Samuel 31. It says this: Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The imagery of this is something that we might be familiar with from watching some sort of battle scene on a movie, but these men have been fighting together, and at some point there's a kind of a rush, there's a tipping point where the Philistine army begins to gain momentum, and they begin to overtake. This description that's being given is them overrunning Israel. And as they overrun, there's Saul and his sons. They've gathered together. And so the picture is that Saul, now the king of Israel, with his sons, Jonathan, who happens to be David's best friend, they're running, and the Philistines are pursuing them. They're overtaking them. They're killing men around them, and they're fleeing for their lives. In this process, Jonathan is struck dead. And then in verse 3, it says that the battle pressed hard against Saul. So Jonathan's dead. Saul continues to run, and the archers found him. So at some point, he's off. He's hiding. He's in some rocks. He's someplace where he's kind of gotten some shelter. And now the archers have found him, and it says he was badly wounded by the archers. And then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And then verse 6 sums this whole thing up. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. This is such an important moment for David because this is a game changer for him. Everything shifts in this moment. David has been on the run with this promise in his heart, and the one person who stood between David and the realization of this promise, the one guy who's tormented him, hassled him, who's been jealous after him, that guy's suddenly removed from the scene. And so not only is Saul gone, not only is David now feeling the relief of the pressure that was on him because he was running from Saul, but now also because Saul is dead, David is the king. There's this game-changing moment here. Look what happens next. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 2, the next chapter over, but in 2 Samuel. It says, on the 3rd day, so after this has happened, on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. So 3 days after the battle, this guy comes running into camp. His clothes are torn. He's covered with dirt. And he lays down and pays homage. He recognizes David as a man of authority, as a king. The fact that he's even present is telling David something. The fact that he looks the way that he does creates a question in David's mind, like, what's going on? What's happened? And so David asks him, where do you come from? And he said to him, I've escaped the camp of Israel. And David now wants to know, like, what's gone on in the camp of Israel? What's happened? David said to him, how did it go? Tell me. And he answered, the people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. When he says Jonathan, obviously this is David's best friend, so there's this moment of losing a friend, and that loss has to come over David. But there's also this sense of Saul being gone. This is game-changing. Naturally, if Saul's been after David, if this has been reported to him, David wants to know the validity of it. Like, tell me, like, how do you know this is true? And so that's what he does in verse 5. David says to the young man, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? Like, is this for real? Am I done running? I mean, I've spent so much time running. Is my best friend really dead? Like, how do you know this? And the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? I answered him, I'm an Amalekite. And just pause right here. And I want you to understand that what he's describing is the fact that Saul has already speared himself, right? He's already gored himself. He's already tried to kill himself. And when this man comes running by, what he's saying is he sees Saul, and Saul is still alive. The king of Israel is still living, and he's desperate for his life in this moment. So verse 10 says this. He says, verse 9, and he said to me, stand beside me and kill me. For anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. Saul is still alive, and this guy takes his life out of mercy. But then look what he does next. Verse 10. So he kills Saul, and then he says, and I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord, to you, David. You ever had a pet that brought home something dead? Anybody? Like usually like a Labrador Retriever, like the first, like number one, offender number one, right? Like, or a cat that killed a bird or whatever. It's always a funny moment, right? Your dog's like, look what I did for you, right? Hey, and they're excited, and you're like, this is great. Like you get your dog, and not only did you bring me something dead that I have to clean up, you're probably going to throw up later because of whatever else you were doing, right? Because that's just the way of dogs. But they're excited, right? It's like, look what I did for you. And then there's this moment of like, we don't really appreciate that the way that other dogs do. This guy shows up to David, and he's sharing these things, and it's like he's a Labrador Retriever bringing a dead bird to the feet of David. He's assuming what we would all assume, right? He's assuming like this has happened, and obviously it's sad that Jonathan's gone, but he's thinking that David, after years of running and after years of hiding and after being so desperate at some point that he ran to the Philistines and actually left God's plan for his life and really went a different direction from what God hoped for his life, like that sort of desperation. This guy's thinking that if you were that desperate for this many years, he's assuming that after all of that, David's going to celebrate that Saul's dead, right? Like just the relief, at least if not celebrate, at least be relieved that the running is over, the pressure is removed. No more do I have to run and hide from Saul. I don't have to defend myself anymore. I don't have to look around every corner waiting for somebody to find me. But I want you to look at what David's response is in verse 11. David hears these words, and it says, then David took hold of his clothes and he tore them, literally rips his clothes off of himself, and so did all of the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening. And look at this, I want you to catch this. For Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they'd fallen by the sword. You realize that what's said here is that David doesn't just mourn Jonathan. It actually says he mourns Saul. He mourns Saul. That's the first person that's mentioned. He mourns. He doesn't celebrate. He doesn't throw a party. He doesn't even look relieved. David mourns. In fact, if you look what else he does in verse 13. David is mourning, a day full of mourning, and that Saul is dead, which I look at this and think, I can't believe David's mourning the death of Saul. But then it says, he says to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And this is interesting. Like, where do you come from? Like, who are you? And he says, I'm the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. And David said to him, how is it that you are not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? David had spared Saul's life so many times. He looks at this guy and he's like, who do you think you are? How in the world could you do this? Like, how could you behave this way towards Saul, the Lord's anointed, the one that God chose to lead Israel? Which tells us even more that what David is grieving and what he's wrestling with is the loss of Saul, the loss of his enemy, the loss of this one that he wrote Psalms about being protected from. Like, Saul is gone, and yet this is his attitude. Like, who do you think you are, killing Saul, the one who made my life miserable, by the way, but who do you think you are? And then verse 15, it says, David called one of the young men and said, go execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, obviously after he was dead, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. I look at this story and I think David just took a massive step toward getting what he was promised. Like, he's had this thing being carried inside of him forever, this promise of a life as the king of Israel. He'd longed for peace. He'd longed for the relief to come. I mean, this was so much a part of David's identity for the past decade of his life. But he's so present. He's so in the moment that he mourns. And in his mourning, in verse 19, David begins to sing a song. David the psalmist, David the one who had been hired by Saul as a young man to come in his courts and play music for him to calm his nerves, David now sings a song of mourning. In verse 19 it says this, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain in your high places." Like Israel, this thing that's happened on Mount Gilboa, we've lost something in this. "How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa," he curses the mountains, listen to this, "let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely." Saul, beloved and lovely. "In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain in your high places. I'm distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished." Guys, David honors Saul. And for us in our product-oriented, corner-cutting culture, this is so revealing. We live in a culture where when something happens in our work environment, if our boss gets fired or our manager, whoever's ahead of us, our first thought is rarely, "That's too bad for them." Our first thought is usually, "I wonder if I'm going to get the promotion so that I can get fired later," right? But isn't that the way we work? Like something bad happens to somebody else and our immediate thought is, like if they're removed, maybe that's an opportunity for me. Maybe I can get that job. Are you accepting applications? Right? That's where we go. Like we live in a culture where if an athlete's on a team and they're on the bench and somebody else on the team gets hurt, we look at it as an opportunity for that person to step up, to rise up. We call it their opportunity, right? Somebody else falters and we step into the gap and we think, well, this is an opportunity. And we're polite about that, but in our hearts there's this thing that says, I'm going to capitalize on the loss of another person. We do that financially. We benefit based on the personal financial losses of others. Sometimes there's an immediate experience of that, right? Where we benefit and somebody loses and it's right there in front of us, or it's far more removed and we don't like to talk about that, but there are others who are being taken from and then we are receiving where they're being exploited in certain situations or scenarios, and we just look at like that as a normal opportunity. That's just life. That's just how we live. That's the way our culture is. In our culture, looking at David responding this way, it's challenging for us. And it's not just because David's not interested in shortcuts. David wasn't focused on the product. David wasn't focused, even though he had carried this thing in his heart, even though God had promised these things, David's looking out at his future and he's saying, it's not about me getting what I want. It's not about the product. It's about the process. David was in the process. David was in the moment. For David, it was more about who he was than what he had. And so what happens next, it just continues to make sense. You see these dots continue to connect, that David is a process guy. He's not a product guy. And that's what makes him great. After the death of Saul, David becomes the king of Judah. Ishbosheth is another son of Saul who wasn't at the battle, who his commander actually anoints him, says that he's going to be the king of Israel. And so the land is divided into two sections, those that are loyal to David and those that are loyal to Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And Abner is the king of, or the leader of Ishbosheth's army, and Joab is the leader of David's army, and there's this clash that begins to happen. There's more fighting, and so now Israel enters into a season of civil war, and there are these ridiculous stories as you flip through the pages of 2 Samuel, moments when guys who know each other are chasing each other on the battlefield, calling out each other's names because they know each other, like, hey, turn, go fight somebody else, don't fight me. I mean, there's really, really fascinating stories of civil war in this moment. And what happens between these nations is they're warring, and eventually Abner, the one that's leading the northern army, decides to come to David and say, you can have Israel, like rule over all of us. Take the army, I'm going to give everything to you. And so he comes to meet with David, and they sit down and they have this conversation. And in the conversation, David says, okay, this is a deal. And so then Abner leaves. Well, during that time, Joab, David's commander, was gone, and Joab returns back to the house, and he finds out that Abner's been there and says, what was he doing here? And David explains, I'm going to be king over everything. And Joab says, don't believe him, he's a liar. Well, Abner had also killed Joab's brother during the Civil War. And so Joab, without David's permission, leaves, chases down Abner, brings him back, and he kills him. And David, this has no bearing. This is a Joab thing. David now is the king of all of the land. And again, we see David respond in a remarkable way. Verse 29, after he finds out what Joab has done, this is what David says. May it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. Basically, he says, if something bad can happen to somebody, let it happen to Joab's house. He curses him. And then in verse 31, it says, David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn before Abner. Like, think about this. Like, David is just the commander of the resisting army has now just been removed, right? David's now in this position where he's the king over Israel, and his first act now in this moment is demanding that people mourn. It says they buried Abner at Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all of the people wept. Do you realize this? Like, David has just become king, and now he's just he's kneeling at Abner's grave. Abner, who'd been fighting against him for years, and David is crying out, saying, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And all the people again wept over him. David, again, it's so counterintuitive to the way that we would respond to our circumstances. We look at the circumstance and we go, well, David, you're going to benefit from this. David doesn't see it that way. Ishbosheth is still up in Israel, and he begins to get nervous. There's these two individuals who come into his house, and while he's in bed, they stab him. They kill him. Saul's son. And obviously these two guys, when they do this, they were thinking they were doing David a favor. They obviously didn't hear the story about the other guy who did David a favor and ran to him with the king's, like, here's a bird. What do you think, So they cut off Ishbosheth's head and they bring it to David as a gift. It says in verse 9 that David answered Rechab and Baanah his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they killed them, and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool of Hebron. Process. David cared about the process. It wasn't about the product. What David cared about is the process, and that is what makes David great. It wasn't a great product, it was a great process. David didn't care about the product, it was about the process. It was at the moment, it's about who am I, not what do I have. And then you read on in 2 Samuel chapter 5, you see the product come, but it comes almost anticlimactically. Like he gets what had been promised him, but look how different it looks. It says, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we're your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. And David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. I read the story and I just wonder, is the reason that we're frustrated, is the reason that we're discontent, is the reason that we're depressed, is the reason that we're disillusioned, is the reason that we have anxiety, is the reason that we just aren't happy, is the reason that we're in those places because we get so focused on the product that we forget about greatness being in the process. Like, is that what this is about? I mean, has greatness become more about the product, or is greatness about the process? What is God doing in our lives in the process? We're always so focused on the product. Get me to there, get me to this, solve this, make the promise come true. But what if the process is where greatness is found? What if what if the place where we really experience life and joy and happiness and peace and all these things is right in the middle of getting to whatever it is we thought we were supposed to be getting to? Rick Rubin, of Beastie Boy fame. Rick Rubin, the record producer, goes into a club in Los Angeles and he sees a familiar face from the past who had lost notoriety. And the guy's name is a name we all know, but at that point in time, people had forgotten. Johnny Cash. Walks in, sees Johnny Cash, and sits there, and after listening to Johnny Cash play in just kind of a burned-out, smoke-filled spot in Los Angeles, goes to him and says, "Would you mind coming with me at some point and recording an album? I have a studio at my house." And Johnny Cash agrees, says, "I'll do that." And so the man in black shows up at his house, and a day turns into a week, and a week turns into a month, and months turn into several months, and Rick Rubin just said to Johnny Cash, he said, "I just want you to sit in front of the mic, just you and your guitar, and just play whatever you want to play. Like, just play." And so Johnny Cash, he played songs that he'd never played before. He played songs that he wrote in that moment. He sang songs that his mom had taught him when he was a young boy. He just sat and for weeks on end just recorded and recorded and recorded, nothing but he and the guitar. At this point, Johnny Cash is living in relative obscurity, and so Rick Rubin goes to him and he says, "What about doing like a show? How about we do a concert?" And so he agrees to it, and he books the Viper Room in Los Angeles. It's a 75-seat club, all black on all the walls, kind of appropriate for Johnny Cash, right? Johnny Cash goes in to perform the concert, and it's just he and his guitar. First time in his life without a band. And Rick Rubin says that in this moment, Johnny Cash is standing there in front of the mic, and he sees that he's incredibly nervous. Like he's just filled with nervousness as he's about to play this song by himself with a guitar. But after he gets going, the room is electric. It's this amazing moment. And everybody that's there just is in awe. They're stunned. The album that they recorded was released. And the reason that another generation discovered Johnny Cash, the reason there were movies made, the reason that we know who he is the way we know him today is because of that moment. And when you listen to the songs, there's this amazing simplicity and yet depth. Like everything has been stripped away, and there's this brilliance that comes out of the music as you listen to it. In the world of art, this is called the art of elimination. Johnny Cash had been through the process, and then they took everything away, and what they found was greatness. When Michelangelo got the piece of stone that he carved the David out of, he said that the David was inside the stone just begging to come out. He was just longing to be revealed. He just revealed what was in there by knocking off the edges. It was the art of elimination. That's what it's all about. The process eliminates and it creates beauty. The process is valuable. Mark Twain said in his later years of his life, he said, "If I knew then what I know now, I would have said a lot less." Simplicity. The difference between a furniture store and a beautifully decorated house is that certain things have been removed and placed there. The process is powerful in our lives. We have these ups and downs. We have all of these things that we experience, these things that we go through. And sometimes we stop and we go, I wish that wouldn't have happened to me. I wish I wasn't in the middle of this. We hate sometimes the things that are going on, the relationships that break, the struggles that we go through, the anxiety that we fight through, the things that we press through. Those things at times feel like misery. They feel like so much work, but they're process. They're process. There's greatness in those moments. For all of the highs, there's a low. And in those lows, there is greatness waiting to be revealed inside of us. There's character that's coming out. David reaches this point in his life when he's experienced the art of elimination. He's in the moment. He understands the process. How do you get there? How do you get there? David becomes the king of Israel and Judah. And then, if you read the Psalms, there's one that's very well known, Psalm 139. And Psalm 139 is a psalm that David wrote after he became the king of Israel and Judah. So shortly after this moment of all of these things happening, David becomes the king and writes a song. And that song reveals certain things about David that I think help us understand how he was able to live in the process differently. As you read that psalm, and you can turn there or read it sometime on your own, but David begins with this whole idea, this whole thought of, God, you have searched me and you know me. He talks about God knowing him before he was even formed in his mother's womb. David describes in detailed words about how, God, you know me. You knew me when I was young. You know me when I'm old. You know me in all of my life. Like before a word comes out of my mouth, David goes, you know me, God, like you know me. David understood that there was this relational dynamic with he and God. God knows him. God understands him. He was just saying, you know me. And then as David continues in Psalm 139, there's this sense, he starts off this kind of second refrain by saying, like, where can I go where your spirit isn't with me? If I go to the highest heights or the lowest lows, if I go to heaven and go to hell, you're always there by my side. God, you never leave me. So not only do you know me, not only are we in this relationship, not only have you known me from the very beginning of time, but you never leave me. In the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, you're always nearby me. And he's looking back at his life as he's now been anointed as the king and crowned as this new leader. And he's saying, no matter where I've ever been in this entire process, you've always been there with me. David has this ability in that moment to see the eternal. He sees the bigger picture. He knows that this temporal life that he's in isn't all of it. As David continues, he describes God's arranging of the details. He describes God orienting the plans and talking about how from the very beginning, from the moment he was in his mom's womb, he was creating a process that would allow him to be who he was. He recognizes this, and then he begins to talk about God's wisdom. He acknowledges, God, you're far wiser than me, you know more, you're far more powerful, and there's this simple recognition. So you know me, you're with me, you made me, and you're way smarter than me. And then the final verses that David says are fascinating. He looks back in this process of his life and he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. David looked at the circumstances, the situations of his life, the good, the bad, all of it together, and he said, God, in the middle of these moments, let me see myself the way that you see me. Shape me, form me, create in me the kind of character that you want me to have. Total surrender to him. He surrenders everything. David says, everything, my whole life is yours. You've been there from the beginning, you'll be there in the end. Total surrender, everything he has to God. Because it's not about the product, it's about the process. Life is process, and God loves the process. And I know that there's jobs that you didn't get that you thought you should have, and there's jobs that you lost that you thought you shouldn't have lost. For some of you, there's jobs that you got and you wish you wouldn't have gotten them. There's relationships that have been broken. There's hurt that you've had. There's teams that you haven't made. There's times when you got cut. There's physical challenges that you face. There's growing old that's a constant reality every time you look in the mirror. There's empty moments when you chased things, you took shortcuts, and they just left you feeling empty. And in all of those moments, there's an opportunity to experience the process. Undoubtedly, we all probably have something right now. All of us have a relationship. We got a job thing, a money thing, a kid thing, a parent thing, a few people. A thing inside of us, whatever it is. Imagine for just a moment that thing wasn't something that you were intended to get through, but what if that was something that God was just using in your life to shape your character? What if that's something that God's using in your life so that you could be great? As difficult as it is, as wonderful it might be, whatever it is, looking at all of it and saying, what if this thing in your life right now is being put there for your own greatness? What if you were able to take whatever that thing is right now and say, about that situation, whatever it is you're wrestling, what if you looked at it and you said, God, you know me. You know me, and you know exactly what this is doing to me right now. And what if you looked at that situation and you said, God, not only do you know me, but you're with me in this. And if you're with me, it must mean that you have some sort of reason, some sort of purpose, something that you're doing in me. What if you actually brought this into my life? What if you've actually allowed this? What if this is a part of just being human and you're going to leverage this so that I can experience greatness? What if, God, you are far more wise. Let me see what you see. And here's my life. That's what David did. Process. The process. God loves process. And the more you love the process, the more you'll start loving the life that you're living. Let's pray. Jesus, I just want to confess to you that it is so revealing when I look at this story just to see how product-oriented I am and where we are as a culture. We're always working to get to a destination. We're always working to obtain that status, to acquire that thing, to reach that point when we think there'll be relief. And yet everything about this story says that those things will never define greatness. Everything about this story says that how we respond in the ups and the downs, in the good and the bad, and even in the moments when the promise is realized, that it's that determines true and genuine greatness. So I pray that you'd allow us to be the kind of people that can pause long enough to say, search me, O God, in the middle of this moment. Is there anything in my heart? You know me, you created me, you made me the way you made me. Is there anything in this you want me to learn? Are you making me great? Give us the courage and the boldness to be those kinds of people who literally experience the transformation in the life that you've come to offer us. And we pray this in your name. Amen.